It was one of those pinch yourself moments that couldn't possibly be real. Leah hadn't believed the email invitation when she first saw it. She thought it was a scam. But here she was on a gorgeous afternoon last September, standing in line with about 80 other people to enter the White House. Excited chatter buzzed all around her, and there was a spirit of camaraderie in the air. Most of the people here didn't know each other, but they'd all contributed in different ways to some aspect of the Violence Against Women's Act. It was the 30th anniversary of that law, and the Bidens were hosting a special event to celebrate the law's achievements and honor those who'd helped bring life to it. The presidential address would happen outside later. A live band was already playing, and rows of chairs lined the manicured lawn. But first, some of the attendees had been invited inside for a portrait with the president. Leah and the others were escorted through the various security portals and the First Lady's wing, and then upstairs to the ballroom. She wandered the room while they waited, awestruck by the ambiance, the historical portraits, and even the molding on the walls in that iconic setting. There was a lot of formality getting everyone lined up for the photo. And as the president entered the room, Leah looked around at all of the people around her. Victim advocates, shelter directors, attorneys and judges, abuse survivors, and even the president, who spearheaded the original Violence Against Women's Act in the 90s. It felt like she was part of something truly important, a movement that was now being celebrated on the biggest stage, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house. And even though Leah had traveled there alone, she could feel to her very core that her son was there with her, her precious boy, Om, who she'd never get to hold again, and who was the reason she was there that day. As Leah and a handful of others stood behind the president during his address, she looked out at the lawn, the sprawling oaks, the glamorous crowd, the Washington Monument and the setting sun in the distance, and she willed herself to soak it up, to imprint this moment in her memory. It was a day she could never forget, and a day she would trade in a heartbeat if it meant getting to wrap her son in her arms just once more. I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories, and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist's chair. My guest today is Leah Moses, a Columbia-educated nurse, midwife, and board member of the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. Her story of trying to escape her psychologist ex-husband illuminates the tragic reality that too many of our social and legal systems do not prioritize the safety or well-being of abuse victims. Before we jump in, I want to pause and offer a warning. We don't shy away from difficult topics here. And in some ways, I guess every episode of this podcast should probably come with a content warning. But some of the elements in these next couple episodes are particularly brutal. I think this is a vital story and one that needs to be heard. But if domestic abuse, child abuse, or sexual violence are your triggers, you might want to check in with yourself before continuing. Leah grew up in a Mormon home, and she says she had a really happy childhood. 4 kids, committed parents, quality time, the whole deal. She also did great in school. And since drawing had always come naturally to her, she went on to major in fine art at Brigham Young University. After college, she interned at the HarperCollins publishing house in New York and started to think maybe she wanted to go into illustration. She was especially drawn to children's books, and looking back, she sees that fascination as sort of an early introduction into the world of maternal child health. But instead of going deeper into publishing, she pivoted to international development, working on literacy projects in places like Ecuador, the Amazon, and Haiti. All of this before the advance of smartphones and Google Maps, when traveling to remote places meant being really remote. This immersive exposure to complex, deeply rooted social issues is another factor that would come to inform Leah's later advocacy.
It was pretty amazing. I mean, I came back from those trips and was committed and thought that I would probably go to law school. I took the LSAT thinking I wanted to do international adoption and maybe something sort of related to alleviating the challenges that I had seen. So I would work for a while and earn as much money as I could, and then I'd go to places like Romania, Ukraine, Belarus. I ended up with a lot of connections and people who had nonprofits, and it was always art related, and I think I'm overstating it, but always sort of maternal child health related. Again, learned a lot about myself and learned that the world was a lot bigger than where I grew up and how I grew up.
All of the travel and exposure to so many different cultures helped Leah develop a foundation of real confidence and a deep belief that she had something to offer. With the new sense of self and all the perspective that comes from travel, she decided to head back to school and pursue a master's in drawing and painting. And that's when she met a man who would change everything.
Just before I started that program is when I met my kid's dad. It was through a mutual friend. I don't go to this place very often because it is quite painful, but I think it's a valid part of the story. When we met through this mutual friend, I didn't know what I was expecting. It was unexpected. I feel like I was meeting someone that fit my standards and ideas and viewpoints so perfectly. It was shocking. I know now what that's all called. There are many labels for that. I understand even clinically, neurologically, what happens when someone first meets a predator, abuser, for the first time. But he was very, very charming, so good at tailoring his interests and abilities and skill set to exactly what I was, quote unquote, looking for. So the fact that I had been quite involved in my religion, for example, he professed to be quite, I don't want to say devout, but it was I'm going to be a millionaire by the time I'm 35. And that fits so well into my paradigm because I didn't grow up with a lot of money. We were a happy family, but at one point for several years, we lived in a trailer, and I had ice on the inside of my closet as a child getting ready for school in the morning. So to hear something like that, and $1 million isn't that much now, but at the time was pretty exciting. Then it was, and I'm going to be, this and that leader in sort of a faith community. And he had all of a sudden all these deep interests in places like Ecuador, Haiti, Guatemala, right? It was just almost exactly tailored. I didn't find out until later that, of course, this was a pattern of behavior.
This man was projecting a carefully curated image of himself that just so happened to align with Leah's life in profound ways. It's a painfully familiar story, and skilled abusers can be excellent chameleons. At that time, he was working in executive development psychology, and he had grand plans of making millions as a corporate psychologist. He was a big shot, and he wanted people to know it. With the benefit of hindsight, Leah can now see that there was something deeply obsessive and narcissistic, or even sociopathic about the way he insinuated himself into her life. At the time, though, this handsome and fascinating man and the attention that he gave her felt pretty great. She knew he had a daughter from a previous marriage, but whatever red flags might have been there in his backstory, Leah could not see them. He seemed like an impressive and ambitious man. Both of his parents had immigrated from India, and he'd just completed a PhD in psychology from Brigham Young. But it wasn't long at all before the mask came off.
I just wanted to say it now that even repeating the story is it rips open this scab. It's not a scar yet for me. And I think one of the reasons why I'm willing to talk about it is because I want so much for anyone who finds this or listens to be able to find a place for themselves in this story, if there is something going on like that, or if they know someone who, if it sounds familiar in any way, to be able to take some action and make change so that it doesn't go as far as my story. It was assault. And I think I could never articulate the thoughts and feelings that I had during that time because, like I said, I hadn't had a lot of relationships, so I didn't have a lot of practice. I had a really loving, caring dad. I had a lot of family support and so many friends around me and really high expectations of myself too. And at the time, I didn't even understand what was happening in the moment. It was very much like you can read and hear clinically about what happens during assault and after. And when it's someone who says, I care so much about you and you're everything I ever wanted, all of the regular things that you would think of, or you can insert all the typical phrases, they all were showered upon me. But at the same time, it was me realizing I felt like a chewed piece of gum, and that's it. I'm now in a place and in a position socially where I will never be able to achieve the other things that I thought would be a part of my life. There was not a lot of discussion in my home about anything of contraception. It just wasn't going to happen. You would be married first. There was not another path. That's the way that you do it. So I thought, well, now this is it. If anyone finds out, I'm done. I will never be able to find anyone who would actually care about me, all of those thoughts and feelings. So you weigh that in your mind with this strong tendency to want to achieve. And I felt like I was at this crossroads and I tried to get away. Many, many, many times tried to get away. Moved, changed my address, went out of town, everything I possibly could. He would find me. He would, and at the time he was living in New York and he would fly back and forth to Salt Lake City where I was living. It didn't matter where I went or what I did. He would stalk neighborhoods until he found my car and came and knocked on my window at 2, 3 in the morning. It was an obsession. Psychologically, it was really challenging to have all of the compliments and gifts and all of the things that happen in those kinds of scenarios. It became so confusing. But I made some very concerted efforts to get away. And each time he would make fun of me more and more. It would be more and more intensely degrading. And I felt like there was eventually really no way out.
Being assaulted, abused, or stalked is already devastating. But then to feel like you're tainted because of it, like no one will ever love you or accept you because you've lost your purity. But in any context, it can be an inherent part of prolonged systemic abuse like this. The abuser works to undermine your sense of self and make you feel like there's something wrong with you, so you'll be less likely to reach out for help. Leah hid what was happening from her friends and family. Later, she would find other women who had been abused by this man as well. But at the time, she felt like she couldn't talk to anyone, like she didn't even have a place in the world anymore. And when his assaults resulted in a pregnancy, he told her she didn't have a choice. An unplanned pregnancy might harm his reputation, and so there was only one thing to do.
The first time that I saved my son's life was not long after conception. So I found out that I was pregnant, kept to myself for quite a while, and then decided that there, again, was no way out. So I presented him with it. He was furious. I was afraid at that time. When I look back now, I think I truly actually was afraid for my own life too. He never brandished a weapon, not even non-fatal strangulation, but it was enough sort of like lunging at me, enough proximity in some of the things that he would do that I do look back now and realize that at the time I was terrified. So I think that one of the things that I did that I'm probably the most, if you can say, proud of in the relationship is saving my son's life. And it wasn't just because that's part of my ethical sort of religious upbringing to avoid abortion. It was really truly because I had the most overwhelming feeling that that was not the right thing for me to do. To keep that pregnancy was totally incongruent with what was happening. I feel like one of the bravest things that I've ever done. So he literally took me to Planned Parenthood, dropped me off on their doorstep and said, "You will go in and do this." It was too late for Plan B. And I went in, sort of did kind of like a nominal meet and greet and walked out again. And he was like, "No, you're going to do it. You're going to go back in there and do it." And when I refused, I had to then just distance. We weren't living together. We were living in the same city, but not in the same house. We had several quote unquote mutual friends, but actually they were all my previous friends. And he had sort of joined this world. At the time, also, we had gone back and forth. He had done the obvious, where he basically hauled me into our religious leader and tried to have conversations about how it was just so hard for him because he had been married before. And so he would dump all of the guilt on me and then remove it from himself and get sort of buy-in from authority figures who were in my life. And then I would realize that not only was I trapped within the relationship, but also it just started to not even leak out. It was rolling out into every other part of my life. So eventually, of course, it became that when I kept the pregnancy, it was, "You will get Medicaid. This is your fault. You will take care of this. I had nothing to do with this. I'm not responsible." And I wouldn't have married him if I wasn't pregnant.
Leah says that everything he did was very calculated and very strategic. He looked for moments to instill fear in her, to make her feel like she was alone and isolated and had nowhere else to go. Because he had a vision for how his life was supposed to go, and he wasn't going to let her mess it up. She would learn later that he'd done this before with other women, which was why he was so adept at, for example, navigating Planned Parenthood. So with Leah feeling like there was no other option, they got married when she was 3 months pregnant.
But I mean, immediately after that, the rejection and the verbal abuse and the physical and the sexual abuse intensified so incredibly. And I could never have seen it coming because I didn't understand this pattern. All that I knew is that I had a baby that I needed to protect. And so I kept going to school after that. I knew I really wanted to finish that degree. I was falling behind. I couldn't come up with a thesis. I had never struggled academically, and all of a sudden I was having a challenging time writing and thinking and putting ideas together, and I felt tons of pressure from my academic community and my mentors in my program. And finally I created a pretty phenomenal thesis, actually, that came out of the beginnings of the ashes. And part of it now is actually at the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art being shown right now. It was called Matronicity. I found this really beautiful definition of basically the identity change going from an individual to a mother. And I loved the term. It was this transformational time of my life. And the definition that I found was in this old public health paper that was written in maybe the 80s, 90s. I love the term. I titled my entire work Matronicity, and I was required to write 7 pages. I wrote 65. I think I filled up an entire gallery. And my favorite collection within that body of work are these movement drawings that I made of my son when I was about 7 months pregnant. I had this stack of coated paper and an ink dropper, and he was moving, and I like around the 32nd, 34th week, and babies have enough muscle power, to really make obvious movements and yet still enough room. And he would just do these acrobatics. And it was so otherworldly to me that I got to be the protector of this new person. And as he moved, I made drawings, and I ended up really loving them and putting them all into this collection. And so for an entire month, day, night, middle of the night, it didn't matter what time, I had this ink dropper and my paper next to me. And I ended up with a couple of 100 drawings and then edited those down and made this actually pretty incredible formal and conceptual collection of images. And then I spent some time making paper. And so it was all very kinesthetic and handwork. And it was put up into a gallery and displayed. And I defended my thesis when my son was about 6 months old.
The idea behind matronicity, that transformation from an individual to a mother, became absolutely vital for Leah. She was a mother now, and she would devote everything she had to loving her son and keeping him safe.
I was bent on doing the delivery myself. I didn't want to have anything that would deter me from knowing him, like from the second that I saw him. So I took childbirth ed classes. I was very involved in the doula community. I found one of the most wonderful doulas. She since passed away. She actually passed away not too long after and she had been at thousands of deliveries. She was like the grandmother of all doulas in the Western United States. And I was so fortunate to have her at my delivery. Consequently, I went back to her when I was pregnant again with my daughter, and she declined to help me because she refused to be in the same room as my kid's dad. And luckily, I had other support at the time too. And it was a very loving decision that she made. And I am very grateful to her for that. But it was incredible. It was 2:30 in the morning, and I delivered him and held him. And like maybe any brand new mother, even in the midst of trauma, even with the person in the room who had assaulted me and caused the pregnancy and had never, frankly, stopped that behavior, it was pretty overwhelming to feel that kind of love. It was completely different than anything I had ever experienced before, and it carried me.
When it came time to name her son, Leah never objected to her husband's assumptions that they would go with a traditional Indian name. She was eager to demonstrate submission, hoping that would lessen the abuse. For his birthday, she even presented him with her new driver's license, because part of her still wanted to please him, hoping he'd be kind to her in return.
I was given a small selection, and I'm glad that I had the chance to choose it from the few that he made available, but it was truly the right name for Om. I don't think that his dad had any idea at the time what kind of a person he was and who he would become. Literally, his name means peace, and I think his entire life he truly meant peace. He would be 18 months old and come over and just stroke my head and say, like, it's okay, mommy, when I was on the floor after an assault. And of course, his dad was drunk or high and had left, and I would oftentimes have no transportation, no money, but we lived in this supposed on the outside semi-affluent neighborhood. And it was just, my whole life was, I think, me trying to salvage any part of who I was and keep that inner, deeper light for truly probably the only purpose was so that my son would survive too.
At this time, Leah starts to learn more about his behavior, including his involvement with other women. She'd find clues like women's shoes in his car or other things around the house. And sometimes she'd gather the strength to leave. But that was if she could get access to her car keys. She'd show up at her sister's house with nothing, not even diapers. And she wasn't even sure what she was asking for, not necessarily even a place to stay, but more of an unspoken plea for help. And by now, her family had started to figure things out.
I left and went back multiple times. And left meaning leave with nothing or leave with a weekend bag. I was too scared to leave completely. And he knew where I was. He would stalk me. I could never actually get away.
To the outside world, her husband was making a name for himself as a therapist. He pivoted from corporate psychology to working with kids, both in their home and in wilderness programs as part of the troubled teen industry, which, as we've established a few episodes ago, doesn't have a stellar reputation when it comes to protecting kids.
He had his own side gigs where he would see kids even in our house. And this is when Owen was a baby. And it was just bizarre circumstances where people would drop their teenagers off, boys and girls. And there were these closed door sessions. He was always afterwards violating HIPAA and every other ethical consideration. And this sounds like these were like normal circumstances where like we're making dinner and he's telling me these things. No, it was always bad, always tension. I was always afraid. There was never a time where I felt calm or safe. So I don't want to give the impression that somehow things were great and then it moved into this really terrible time. But when he would tell me about these kids and these sessions that he would do independently in our home, he would relate to them. Oh, this kid, he broke into the neighbor's house and he was standing over the girl's bed, and there's evidence that he probably molested his younger siblings, and he kept talking about how relatable this kid was. And that wasn't the only one. There were several. And it always creeped me out. I mean, but I felt like at that time, I have a kid, I'm married, what do I do? How do I get out of this? He controls all the finances, that classic situation. So he moved through his profession and kept doing these wilderness treatment assessments where he was the contracted psychologist to do IQ testing and other interviews, all of the usual, I think, psychology testing. But he would do them like in his car in the middle of nowhere with whatever kid he was interviewing. And he always left in a really strange state and came back in a really strange state. There was never a time related to his work that I didn't feel really uncomfortable. The directors of those programs would find out that he switched the kids' names in reports. So he'd create these huge reports that were intense psychological, supposed to be, these scrutinizing examinations of these troubled teens. Parents are paying extra tens of thousands for them. And basically he would just change the name, use the same report over and over again. And there were a couple of times where he was caught, where the family received the report and said, this isn't our kid's name. And to my knowledge, there was no accountability for it. I don't know those families. I don't know the names, but it was appalling to me that that industry would just keep going like that. And he wasn't the only one who would do it. But I think of all people, he certainly felt like he was sort of the king on top. He was the one who was going to get away with all of it.
He felt he was entitled to control everything, both at work and at home. He demanded complete control over Leah's life. And even when she went along with whatever he wanted, he continued to abuse her. No matter how she tried to appease him, his behavior didn't change. And anytime she tried fleeing, he knew exactly how to track her down and coerce her back. So it was only a matter of time before she found herself pregnant again.
I had a miscarriage in between those pregnancies. And I think one example of the coercive control that's involved in these kind of relationships, I was with some friends. I started bleeding. I realized what it was. And of course, he found out. He was in the house. He made sure that he was in the bathroom with me. And I passed what was very obviously not just fetal tissue, like it was obvious, maybe a 12, 13 week. And he took it and flushed it. And that's something that I know is quite graphic. I'm in women's health now, so I feel like I can talk about it clinically. And I think as I went through that transition also in losing that pregnancy, I was grateful because I didn't want to bring any other child into this scenario. But at the same time, watching the water go down, and I think it just reiterated to me, like, I will never get out of this. Like, I don't even have control. I don't have control of my own body. And now I don't even have control over anything that I create. So then, of course, I was terrified to be pregnant with a girl and decided that I wouldn't even go back to a hospital because I was concerned that they would not only see possibly physical evidence of abuse, but also I was worried that if anyone really found out what was truly happening behind closed doors, that they would take my son away from me. So I thought, well, I'll go to a birth center and I can trust midwives in a birth center. And that way there will be fewer eyes on me. I can deliver unmedicated. I know I've already done it before. The doula that I had wanted to be with me and be my support person had declined. I have to find somebody else. And it was truly the midwives of this birth center that were the bridge for me between, I think, the world of feeling utterly, completely isolated and then being able to do the physicality that a delivery requires again. And he was horrific throughout the pregnancy. I had to be treated for sexually transmitted infections afterwards. It was all of those things you can imagine. And delivering her, it was in a tub in this, sounds terrible, this quiet little strip mall. He refused to pay them the rest of what we had owed. So they did it anyway. I think it was probably out of pure love for me and probably some kind of understanding, because during prenatal care, one of them pulled me aside and said, "You can do better than this." And she had only seen him one time. He only showed up to one visit ever. And in both pregnancies, I was late to prenatal care. I was lucky that I had even maybe half of the visits in before I delivered. He was very good at later on also is manipulating and removing medical care or using medical providers to manipulate the situation. And that became very effective later on in the legal part of our case. I think maybe the way that I even tell the story right now is probably a reflection of how intense it was.
It's hard for Leah to keep track of the exact timeline of everything that has happened, which is very common. With such horrendous trauma, when it's all-consuming for years, there's no arrangement of words, no simple chronology of events that can truly contain the story. Because this isn't a movie, it's very real. But even though it's hard to map out exactly when certain things happened, Leah can identify when she knew for sure it was time to take the kids and try to leave her husband for good.
My daughter was 6 months old, and I had this big plan. My family was involved. At that time, they were scared of him too, but I had a friend who was an attorney, not a family law attorney, but an attorney. And so she and I talked and planned, and I finally escaped to her house, actually. We went to Home Depot and bought temporary blinds, shuttered every window. And it was her 2 children, boys a little bit older than Ohm, and then my daughter. And she came with me to the basement of the YWCA. I made a protective order report, and I thought, this is it. I'm going to be able to tell them once I say something, I'm going to be protected, because I had heard over and over again that once you get a protective order, then there's all kinds of things on your side. So I had no idea what kind of systems I was stepping into. And the domestic violence detective who interviewed me was very well-meaning. She saw me, and I showered, I did my hair, I put on clean clothes. I didn't want to look like a victim. And then after that experience, I was told you need to tone it down a little, actually a lot. You need to start looking like a victim because you're too educated, you're too nice, you're too polite, and you tell your story so well and all cleaned up, and you don't look like you really need help. And that was also one of the first times that I realized that this whole world of believing victims or believing survivors, there are lots of different ways to say that, is very convoluted.
We see this in the media all of the time. The Goldilocks problem. If you look too disheveled and dysregulated, people might think you're crazy and unreliable. But if you look too competent and put together, if you don't show up with a black eye or your arm in a sling, they may assume you must not really be a victim. So it becomes the survivor's job to present themselves in a way that conforms to other people's expectations of abuse. It's on them to make sure that they check all of the right boxes so that their story will be taken seriously. And God forbid you present as unlikable. Leah had enough plausible details backing up her story, and the judge seemed to believe her when she said she was afraid of her husband. She was granted a temporary protective order to keep the kids away from him. But to no one's surprise, he violated the order several times. When Leah told the police about these violations, they didn't seem to care. Meanwhile, he was hard at work getting the order lifted.
He had hired an incredible father's rights attorney who convinced the commissioner, who was about ready to go on his lunch break, that we were a wrestling family. And that was the reason why there was any kind of narrative about him being on top of me or anything happening in front of kids, because we were just very athletic. It was the most asinine, dumb thing to say, but with his suit and tie and with the attorney, it didn't matter that I had a stack of 20 affidavits from friends that were saying how much things had changed, how much I had changed. I still wasn't able to fully articulate the trauma at that moment. And because I did not have a black eye, a broken arm, or any hospital report, I think I had 1 or 2 police reports, or maybe none at that time. So it was dismissed.
Leah ended up moving back in with her husband because she wasn't about to let her kids live with him without her there to protect them. And over the next couple months, while she tried figuring out what to do, he continued manipulating things to keep her under his control. He had her start therapy, and it just so happened that the therapist he selected for her was supervised by his therapist. And she had to sign a waiver letting them share all of her information with each other. Meanwhile, he was growing more and more established in his own career.
So he has his own practice, he's doing therapy. I think just after this, he started doing online therapy for men who were in separation or divorce situations, of course. There was quite a bit of money to be had within that troubled teen industry. And these are parents who are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for their children to be there. Many of them are exposed now as being horrific places where there was a lot of abuse happening. And he was complicit in all of that. And he would do the inpatient ones. He would go to the wilderness program. So this guy out in a Land Cruiser in the middle of nowhere that is meant to go pick up the kids who are out camping, living on beans and rice, where their parents think that they're being reformed. And he's doing, IQ testing in the middle of a field or on the side of a mountain somewhere. You can only imagine what may have happened then, because I found even more evidence of child porn during that time. I found more women were coming to me talking about their assaults that they had experienced during the time period before I even met him. So all of this sort of continues, it moves along. And then we were back together. He decides that this is going to be for the long haul. Like, he's going to make sure that I do not tell this story. So I was told things like, your IQ is so low, you can't function. You'll never survive without me. I will make sure that basically your whole life implodes if you dare to leave and tell anyone what's going on.
By now, they had moved out of their more affluent neighborhood and into a seedy duplex that her husband owned. And it was there, cut off from the outside world, that Leah found something that would make this story even darker and more sinister.
The straw that really broke, I think, and this is a pivotal moment in the story, is that he was gone. He left on some trip. I went into the garage. I feel like I was completely guided. There was this garage that was sort of like in the middle of the 2 units that were attached. At this point, he's stalking me every single day. He knows exactly where I am. And I think he had other people following me too while he was gone, because I would see different beat up cars out in the front. And it was this cinder block duplex that was mouse infested. And I was doing everything I could to clean it and trying to fix up the yard and do anything I could to just make myself feel normal. And again, couldn't get a job. He wouldn't allow anybody else to do childcare except who he approved. And as I went into the garage, I found this box. And when I went straight to it, opened up the box, and we're talking about a disaster of a garage, right? Client reports strewn all over the floor, old furniture. It was this pack rat that just shoved tons and tons of basically evidence into this place. So I went to the garage, went to this box, opened up a binder, realized that it was a journal entry of his. And I happened to open to exactly the right page. And he wrote in his 20s, I'm a sex addict and a child molester. I'm afraid I'll do it even to my own children. And then proceeded throughout the rest of those pages to basically disclose assaults. So when my son was a baby, he would have kids come over for individual therapy, and they would go in behind closed doors to his office, and they'd walk to the Sev and get a Slurpee and walk back again. And then he would do therapy in his office. Apparently he was helping them with homework and whatever else. And I wasn't allowed to be in the house because then that would be a HIPAA violation. It was like this revolving door of kids that would come in. I can only imagine now what that scenario was. And I was so deep in my own trauma, I didn't realize at the time. But when I found that journal and started to look back, I realized the pieces just started falling together. And I went straight to this domestic violence detective and turned it in.
For the first time in a while, Leah felt like there was real momentum in her case. Like this journal would be the key she needed for legal protection against her husband. Finally, there was a reason to hope. But as we will get into next week, family court is not always that logical. The system will still find plenty of ways to fail Leah and her children. I hope you'll join us in the next episode as we continue this profound and heartbreaking story. Thank you to my guest this week, Leah Moses, for bravely sharing her painful story and helping raise awareness and educating others. A special thanks as well to the writer of our show, Bo Denton, and our talented audio engineers at Peachtree Sound for bringing this episode together. Be sure to join us next week for part 2, where we'll continue this important conversation and dive even deeper into the challenges of the #MeToo family court system.